All right, hello and welcome everybody. I'm Philip Lipsey, the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan, as well as the Richard Charles Lee Director of the Asian Institute here at University of Toronto. Welcome to today's event, Religion and Politics in Japan Today, New Perspectives from Grassroots-Level Activists. Before we begin, I'd like to deliver a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to extend my thanks to Nasim Hashim, Ria Ayema, Sakura Armstrong, and the Asian Institute and Monk School event staff for their administrative support of today's event. We have a few upcoming events that may be of interest. On March 9th, we'll have Kent Calder from SAIS, Johns Hopkins, to talk about what is global Japan. I guess that's a topic of great relevance for us, given that we're the center for the study of global Japan. So hope to see some of you there. And on March 27th, Saori Katada from USC will be here to talk about her latest book on Japan's grand strategy. So hope to see some of you at those events as well. So with that, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Levi McLaughlin back to his alma mater. The most important thing to know about him, of course, is that he obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in Asian studies from the University of Toronto. And so I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with him and his work. And we had the pleasure of inviting him to a virtual event in 2021. Some of you might remember this, but it was during the pandemic, of course, and we couldn't have him in person. So it's really wonderful to finally have him come out and be here in his physical presence with you today. So he's a professor at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University. He received his PhD from Princeton and has held previous affiliations at University of Tokyo, Kokugakuin University of Michigan, National University Singapore, University of Iowa, and Wofford College. He is very much the leading expert of religion in modern and contemporary Japan, and he's particularly well known for his work on Soka Gakkai and Komeito, which is covered in his book, Komeito, Politics and Religion in Japan in 2014, as well as Soka Gakkai's Human Revolution, published in 2019. The hallmark of his research approach is really kind of meticulous ethnographic work in which he embeds himself directly, and you'll see this in his presentation later, as an observer in organizations and networks that are often impenetrable and opaque to outside observers. He was really the first non-member, non-Japanese researcher to spend years as a participant observer of Soka Gakkai, and he's more recently conducted similar research vis-a-vis other Japanese politically consequential religious organizations, which he'll talk about today. And really, the only person I'm aware of who's carried out this kind of work. So truly innovative and insightful. So the topic of today's talk, of course, is both important and timely. The Unification Church scandal in the aftermath of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's assassination brought the LDP's longstanding ties to religious organizations to the forefront and created a significant political setback for the party, from which they really only just recently recovered. The Soka Gakkai affiliate Komeito's decision to exit their long-standing partnership with the LDP has also significantly scrambled the landscape of Japanese party politics. So although Japanese policymakers generally don't talk about religion openly, or at least do so in fairly modest terms, it's undeniably an important factor in order to understand contemporary Japanese politics. And there's really no better person placed to decipher this for us and to provide insights about what's going on behind the scenes than Levi. So with that, welcome back to Toronto. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Philip, to Nassim, to the center. It's wonderful. This seems to be the grad school, right? I feel like a Rip Van Winkle when I come back to Toronto. So as Philip was mentioning, I do work on the intersection of religion and politics in Japan. Almost all of it is ethnographic, which means that I talk to humans. I take part in rituals. I undertake training with organizations as a non-member, but people have been extremely open, extremely kind to allow me to do so. I want to talk about people, but I think in order to really make sense of people's lives, we need context. And so I'm going to spend most of today talking about the context of religion and politics in Japan today. And thereafter, perhaps while we can speak with one another, bring in some specific examples of people's lives. But let me start with what we're talking about today. So here's a photo we can start with. This is from the very beginning of 2026. This is at the Grand Shrine at Ise, which is where the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami is enshrined. She is the imperial ancestress of the imperial family, including the emperor who sits on the throne today. On January the 6th, Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae, as you can see here in the center, visited the Grand Shrine carrying a photograph of her mentor, the assassinated former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, effectively bringing him in his imminent presence back to the shrine where he convened the G7 summit. And so religion and politics, like in Japan, as is the case in any other country, are intertwined. And you can't really talk about politics unless you actually take religion seriously. But in Japan, this has a particularly consequential aspect to it because Japan is characteristically one of the least religious countries in the world. And so if there are periodic surveys conducted by major newspapers, pollsters of other sorts, and they'll ask questions along the lines of, do you have religious faith? Very loaded question to ask anyone, right? And by and large, the average in terms of the respondents to those kinds of questions, 1 in 5 or so people will affirm, yes, I have religious faith, which is one of the lowest rates in the world. Why? Why is this the case? Especially when it's very obvious that religion has a place in the halls of power. Well, there are a number of overlapping historical reasons for that I think never really go away in terms of their influence. And we can start with the very fact that to use the word religion or to discuss religion in any way in Japan is a political act. Political act everywhere, but has a very specific historical identity in Japan. The word for religion in Japanese, shukyo, is a translation of initially actually Dutch, but thereafter English translation in the middle of the 19th century. It was required to be translated in the context of the arrival of imperial powers that were busy forcing Japan open to this rapidly modernizing world. And so the story of Japan's rapid transformation into an expansionist, imperialist nation state includes the importance of religion as an umbrella category that was introduced for the first time in this fashion. And so as you can see here in this, I love this stylized woodblock print version of the arrival of the Kurofune, the black ships, these ironclad vessels led by Commodore Matthew Perry of the American Navy, first in 1853 and then 1854, forcing Japan open. And so as part of religion entering the Japanese lexicon, becoming a legal term for the first time, a political term, there was also an arbitration process that was initiated from this, determining what counts as religion. And so religion, of course, must have its opposites, the real versus fake. And so there was a vocabulary that developed around that in Japanese. So for example, the notions of inchiki shukyo, fake religions, meishin jakyo, superstitious false teachings. And then up to the present, we have cult. And so we have this sort of successive importation of ideas, of frameworks for understanding that which is legitimate, polished against that which is false. And so because of this very specific Protestant American introduction of the concept, we have a series of kind of presuppositions that go with it, some baggage. Things like you're supposed to go to church. You're supposed to know things about scripture. You're supposed to have a sort of a centrality of interiorized faith, hence questions on surveys like, do you have religious faith, right? And also the notion that you belong to a religion. None of this fits really well in Japan, right? And so this specter of the past, I love this painting, by the way. This is a painting in 1853 of the arrival of the black ships. The title, I think, says it all: carrying the gospel of God to the heathen, la plus ça change for American imperialism. And so this remains the case, of course, up to the present, right? But there's more recent events that have really solidified the image of religion in Japan in an entirely negative way. Most recently, of course, with very much the living memory for the vast majority of people in Japan is the March 1995 attacks by the apocalyptic group Om Shinrikyo using sarin gas, killing 14 people, injuring thousands, and utterly devastating the image of religion for a generation in Japan, to the extent that when I tell people I study it, I'm always asked, oh, do you study Om Shinrikyo? A tiny group, 1,000 or so practitioners at its height. Really, I mean, relatively speaking, quite small and marginal, nonetheless has this enormous impact. There have been moments where the public image of religion was rehabilitated to a certain extent, so somewhat strikingly, in the aftermath of the March 11th, 2011 earthquake disasters, the compound disasters of the earthquakes, tsunami, nuclear meltdown in Northeast Japan. Part of the national response to rehabilitate Japan included mass mobilization of resources by religious organizations. And this created a kind of minority narrative that's available to people of religion isn't just this scary specter, but is actually a force for good, a significant contributor to national reconstruction in the wake of catastrophe. But more recently than that, however, is a return to kind of this steady norm in Japan of religion being this scary other, most specifically because of the shocking murder of Japan's most powerful politician in July of 2022, while he was campaigning on behalf of his party, the majority Liberal Democratic Party, on the streets of Nara in Western Japan. Abe Shinzo was gunned down by Yamagami Tetsuya, who was just convicted for this crime, will be likely spending his life in jail, notably not being given the death penalty. Japan does have the death penalty, largely because of sympathy that welled up in the aftermath of the murder for him because of his upbringing in the highly stigmatized Unification Church, better known, I think, by its pejorative label, the Moonies, well known in Canada as well. He grew up in this organization, presented his upbringing by his mother, who was a very devoted member of it, saw that Abe had strong ties himself and also his family to the Unification Church, and decided, I can't get to the church members or the church leadership, but I can get to him. So this has, again, triggered a sort of like highly negative response to the presence of religion in the public sphere, in the popular imagination. And as a result, the Unification Church has been ordered legally dissolved. So this is an ironic sort of success of the assassination. The church did not commit the murder, but they're being punished for it. There's legacies of this way, of this intersection of religion and politics, the efforts to govern religion on the part of politicians and law. There's this prophetic belief in the power of law to oversee religion that persists in Japan. There's a sense that if we can just get the right laws or just get the right interpretation of existing legislation or the Constitution, we can control this thing that kind of refuses to go away. This doesn't work, obviously, right? And who is attempting to undertake this kind of enterprise? Well, it's a network of academics, bureaucrats, lawyers, leaders of groups that enjoy sanction, mostly temple-based Buddhist organizations, Shinto groups, groups that can claim to be not just religion, but custom, tradition, these sorts of labels that are get around clauses instead of using the scary word religion. But also you see this in media, we see this a lot in social media, other influencers who guide determinations of what should count as legitimate. And the result is basically a balkanization. On the one hand, you have the reliable but responsibility laden. So we have things like tradition, culture, religious groups and conventions that enjoy sanction. And on the other, we have the scary other against which these are defined. So superstition, cults, magic, and so-called new religions, basically anything founded in the last 2 centuries. This is new in Japan, it's newer than Buddhism, for example. But this kind of bifurcation animates enthusiasm for what you can call like third space alternatives, things that happen outside of this or between these 2 options. And these include the use of spirituality. And in the same way that, for example, in Canada, the identity of being spiritual but not religious is very popular, particularly amongst younger folks, also has a distinctive identity in a Japanese context. But we also see this third space taking shape, for example, in politics, in education, in media, in business, other spheres. And the activists initiate a broad range of institutional formats. We see political parties, lobby groups, corporations, NGOs, schools, all sorts of other stuff like that, that really shape religion and its parameters from outside of its formal contours. Well, I'm going to talk about one of those places, and that is the arena of electoral politics, and very specifically, the government. So we are in a new political era. Things are changing real quick, as they are everywhere in the world, aren't they? But in Japan, it's been striking, especially in the last few months. There's been a really big change. So for about a generation and a bit, for 26 years, the Japanese government was dominated by a ruling coalition. From 1999 to October of 2025, you had 2 parties that, with the exception of 3 years in there, ran the government. These are the majority Liberal Democratic Party, which has been dominated Japanese politics since 1955, with the exception of a few years here and there, which is strongly informed by highly motivated ideologues who are largely characterized as being on the right. They're definitely nationalist. They belong to a series of organizations. I'm going to talk about one of them in particular, called Nippon Kaigi, Japan Conference, but also it includes the Unification Church, which had strong ties to the LDP, and numerous other ideologues along these lines. And on the other hand, we have Komeito, which is a party founded in 1964 by the lay Buddhist organization Soka Gakkai. Soka Gakkai remains Japan's most successful modern religion in terms of convert numbers. It's certainly its most successful religious export, if you think of the number of people who joined Soka Gakkai, more than Zen even. And so I think of these 2 spheres as essentially as competing ecologies for the intersection of religion and politics. These are basically attempts not just to gain votes and change policy, but to shape people and shape the country there through that. I think it's quite limiting to think of it purely in terms of electoral politics. Just to give a little more detail, Soka Gakkai, I've spent about 30 years or so with members of Soka Gakkai in Japan. I characterize it as being the product of twin legacies. On the one hand, it is a lay Buddhist organization that follows the teachings of the medieval monk Nichiren, who had a very solid, severe interpretation that only the final teaching of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, which is the Lotus Sutra, is meaningful in our degraded age. And so members of Soka Gakkai chant the lotus. They have reverence for Nichiren and his inscribed objects of worship. They carry out a conversion tactic called shakubuku, which is historically been a very strong, hard sell approach to convert people. And they conceive of their mission, which is very broad, including politics, as kosen rufu, to widely declare the Dharma. But on the other hand, it is a gakkai, in Japanese means study association. And so the name is Value Creation Study Association. That's what Soka Gakkai means. It began as an educational reform movement. And so that legacy remains very strong, very much focused on pedagogy, very focused on humanism, and so things like electoral politics are entirely coherent and meaningful within a Gakkai history and contemporary framework. On the other hand, I'm going to talk about a group that I've in more recent years spending a lot of time with. And this is a highly stigmatized organization. I spent a lot of time with highly stigmatized organizations called Nippon Kaigi. Japan Conference is kind of a banal name for a very influential group, which is quite small though. It's a meeting point for diverse activists. They only have about 38, maybe 40,000 signatories. If you go to local level meetings, they're very small. But the types of people who attend tend to be highly influential. They tend to be elected officials, others who can wield a lot of influence. It's a group that has figured out that you don't necessarily have to have lots of people if you have the ear of very powerful people. It's a meeting point for a majority of the LDP's Diet politicians. The Diet is the Japan Parliament, including the current prime minister and cabinet ministers, numerous business leaders, journalists, educators. It has a very strong Shinto affiliation and identity. If you go to Nippon Kaigi offices, there are what are called kamidama. These are Shinto altars that are in place in meeting spots. It's really notable. It also includes ethics training organizations that self-identify as not being religious, other highly ideologically motivated actors that join in Nippon Kaigi. They conflate pragmatic and transcendent aims. And you can sort of see this from, for example, the splash page of their homepage, which has, of course, the sacred mountain of Fuji, which is itself understood to be, in Shinto terms, to be Akami and the home of Kami, which are the gods of Shinto. And the slogan on the page is Hokori aru kunizukuri e. So toward making a nation with pride. And this, I think this verbalization, kunizukuri, nation making, matters a lot. So I think it's emblematic of the kind of overall intention behind not just Nippon Kaigi, but more generally, these groups that are involved. So Nippon Kaigi has, I think, a combination of immediate and more distant and ideal and sort of utopian aims. The more immediate aims are to amend the Japanese constitution. Japan has the history's longest unamended constitution. It came into effect in 1947. It's never been amended, and it's very famous for Article 9, which is the so-called peace clause, which is basically Japan is not to maintain war materials or to use war as a means of resolving international disputes. Adding a third clause would mean allowing to the legality of the self-defense forces. And also promoting laws, for example, preventing women from taking from retaining their family names. This is a big deal for various reasons. Ensuring that the imperial line remains patrilineal through various means as well. In other words, belief matters. Belief that the emperor is indeed divine. Belief that there is this unbroken lineage back to the sun goddess matters a lot. This is not metaphorical, it's real. And I think it also helps us understand the ultimate objectives of affiliates, which include not just amending, but doing away with the 1947 Constitution entirely and replacing it with not just, the versions that I've heard, there's been all sorts of proposals going back to the 1890 Constitution, which had the emperor as head of the government. But actually, the really big influence is the 17 Article Constitution of the year 604 from Shotoku Taishin, which is an indivisible union of sovereign and people. To eliminate this constitutional divides between religion and government, to cultivate a return to what's called in Japanese matsuri goto. So those of you who can read Chinese or Japanese will notice that the character for matsuri goto is the same character as for government in seiji or seifu. To remilitarize Japan, including having nuclear weapons. This is very much on the table for affiliates. And to cultivate overall educational and social policies to cultivate citizens as subjects, as imperial subjects. Who are these folks? They're a fluid network of activists from a broad range of religious, as an institutional, educational, social class, even ethnic backgrounds is notable. Not everyone is Japanese, actually. They maintain intimate ties to the Liberal Democratic Party, other conservative lawmakers. They often fight with one another, though. They really talk crap about one another a lot. quite shamelessly. But they also will agree to cooperate because they will coalesce around nostalgia for an imagined glories of Japan's imperial past. And they regard political engagement as a necessary but limited component of what I would call a cultivation campaign, to cultivate the person. And most important in this are personal ties and shared ideals. Things have changed in recent months to allow for a really dramatic upheaval in that existing two ecology system, to the point where we're seeing this marked dominance of a very conservative LDP, strongly informed by these long cultivated ideals promoted by Nippon Kaigi and its affiliates, and the sharp drawing away of Komeito and Soka Gakkai from the public sphere. This has a lot to do with the rise of the current prime minister, Takaichi Sanae. She's Japan's first woman prime minister. She's extremely ideologically motivated. She's had a long career of putting herself forward in that manner. I think it's easy. The best way, I think, to understand not only her success, but kind of her general motivation for engagement is to think of it in ideological rather than, you might say, conventional, pragmatic political terms. I think that's our best way to understand what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. So in October of 2025, the leader of Komeito, a guy named Saito Tetsuo, was faced with a dilemma because the LDP, through an internal party election, selected Takaichi as the new leader of the party, which made her the prime minister of Japan. And that became a dilemma. Up to this point, Komeito and the LDP had cooperated, mostly because Komeito was holding its nose and encouraging its support base, the members of Soka Gakkai, to go out there and gather votes for their own politicians, but also for their LDP allies. So they didn't agree, they didn't get along, but this was an arrangement that came together in the late 90s for a bunch of reasons I could talk about, which allowed the Komeito to be part of the government. It protected them. It protected the leader of Soka Gakkai, their honorary president Ikeda Daisaku. It insulated the group from legal and, to a certain extent, popular attacks they had endured for decades prior to that. The costs were quite severe. They had to backtrack on a lot of their founding ideals. They had to give up their founding pacifism. They had to give up a lot of other stuff along those lines. But where they really drew the line was in the last couple of years, a bunch of the LDP top politicians were embroiled in a slush fund scandal. Really sleazy use of public funds to go into the coffers of factions within the LDP that were untaxed and otherwise obscured from public scrutiny. This was the straw. This was a straw. This is following the revelations of the Unification Church. And so this kind of was this breaking point. And basically, Saito, the leader of Komeito, was faced with a decision that was foisted on him by local level members of Soka Gakkai, most specifically women, most specifically the women's division, who historically have been the engine that has driven vote gathering in Japan. So I think one of the untold stories of Japanese politics now is that we're in this position now because homemakers made it happen. Homemakers within Soka Gakkai said, we can't support them anymore. They're too sleazy. They're just too corrupt. We can't, in good conscience, go out to the polls for these folks anymore. So we said, okay, we're done. We're done. We're splitting with, we're ending a 26-year-long arrangement with this party, and we're going to let them do their thing. And that's what happened. So there's been a great deal of activity since then. Takaichi took the reins. She was greeted with enormous public enthusiasm. As misogyny is always operative, but in Japan it's like air. And so generally speaking, commentators and analysts ignore 50% of the population. And so they were, I think, struck by the fact that the presence of a woman, a very confident, very capable well-spoken woman at the apex of Japan's political system, inspired many, many people, especially women, to support her. And people, I think, who would otherwise not be cool with her policies, nonetheless support Takaichi. She's very, very popular, remarkable. Japan has never seen a politician like her. And I hate to make predictions because it's always stupid to do so, but she's going to be around for a long time. And she's completely transformed Japanese politics. And so one of the results of this is an absolute sort of decimation of the opposition. And so Komeito in opposition now decides, well, actually we're going to get murdered if there's an election. And there is suddenly, boom, there's a snap election that happens in January. And so they decided to dissolve Komeito in Japan's lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and merge with what was at this point Japan's largest opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, and they create this thing called the Centrist Reform Alliance. The Chudo Kaikaku Rengo. Chudo is a Buddhist term, the middle path, and this is deliberate. This allows for Komeito, the vote gathering machine through Soka Gakkai, to appeal to its Buddhist roots. Members of Soka Gakkai, whom I've been spending time with, have expressed enthusiasm about this. They said, hey, this gives us a chance to perform shakubuku, to actually carry out our overall mission through this new vehicle. And they also, in a very savvy way, placed their candidates at the top of the proportional representation tier list. Japan has a very complicated voting system, unlike Canada. Like if you go to the polls, you have two votes. You vote for the candidate in that district, and you vote for the party. And if you're strategic, you can split those votes. And that has been the case for especially opposition parties in Japan. And so ordinarily it works, but this was a case in which things fell apart. Or in this case, we did not see Soka Gakkai muster its historic voting strength. Members I talked to did not carry out their usual really intense campaign of gathering votes. They didn't gather at 7:30 every morning at a culture center to gin one another up and get them out there. They did not draw up lists of names of people to contact. They didn't do any of that stuff. They also, what I was told by members, they were worried because you've spent decades supporting the Liberal Democratic Party, and now suddenly, the drop of a hat, you're going to go support the people you've characterized as your enemy within 2 weeks. It didn't work. They got murdered, absolutely murdered at the polls. And so, but the irony is that Komeito's politicians gained seats because they're at the top of this PR list, while their ally basically got wiped off the map. In the meantime, during the campaign, we see a new political phenomenon take shape in the form of Takaichi, who ran, not just me, many people have characterized a presidential campaign. Japan is not a country of charismatic politicians. Is that a safe thing to say? It's like, this is not famous for its stunning orators, for people who really take the reins and hog the spotlight. Not a thing, really. There's been a few exceptions, but no one's seen anyone like Takaichi. And she's really run with this. There are obviously right now global models to follow in this regard. And she has taken up the reins of her mentor Abe as a Trump whisperer, for what it's worth, as well. He was very much, he occupied that role globally. She's doing the same thing. I think this campaign poster kind of demonstrates that, this reaching out, smiling too, which is rare actually in a campaign poster. And it worked. Her party gained an absolutely enormous majority in more than 2/3 of the seats of the lower house. In fact, they got so many votes, they ran out of candidates. They didn't have enough people on their proportional representation list. They could have had, I think it's 16 more politicians elected, and so they're actually below what they would be their strength. The photo on the right there, I think, is quite telling. It's a little hard to tell with this resolution, maybe, but this is a photo of the campaign headquarters of probably the most notorious politician caught up in the slush fund scandal, a guy named Hagiuda Koichi, who importantly was re-elected in a really big way in a Soka Gakkai stronghold. in the city called Hachioji. It's in Western Tokyo. It's where Soko University is. The Komeito politicians made a special effort to really get out the vote, and they failed. They absolutely failed. And I think it's what you can see on the walls of his victory headquarters there are him, this campaign poster, and a framed photo of Abe Shinzo, who is apotheosized. He's a sacralized person. He affectively occupies the space. He's very much alive in conservative circles. And so as you can see, things have shifted now to the point. And why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons, most notably because of Article 96 of the 1947 Constitution. If you want to amend the Constitution, one reason it has gone so long unamended, you need 2/3 votes in both the lower and upper houses. And then, and very importantly, you have to hold a referendum in Japan, 50% plus one vote to pass. And that has not been within reach. Not even close, especially when it comes to the very sensitive issue of Article 9, of changing Japan's identity as a peace country in the post-war. It's within reach. It's within reach. They don't have the votes in the upper house now. They amply have the votes in the lower house. And I think given the political capital of Takaichi, it's something we have to really take seriously as something that might happen soon in the years to come. One reason is because of this drawing down of what used to be the break. The presence of Komeito was very significant in the ruling coalition. They actually called themselves the opposition within the government. And they also called themselves the hadome, the break, holding back the most intransigent impulses of the LDP, most notably when it comes to constitutional revision. That break is now gone. But it's part of a sort of overall drawing down. Soka Gakkai was a post-war phenomenon. It grew from a few thousand members in the immediate years of the post-war to millions of members within about 20 years. And it attracted largely marginalized people who could realize their personal and collective aspirations. And politics was a big part of that. Political victories demonstrated the efficacy of the practice, led in a big way by Honorary President Ikeda Daisaku, who died in November of 2023. And since his death, we've seen a general kind of pulling back from mass organizational sort of events. And also a huge recognition of a massive demographic shift. Everyone's aging. Japan is one of the fastest aging populations. It's weird to say fastest aging. It sounds like they're just means basically there's like a whole lot of babies and not very many babies, right? And so that's what's happening now. We're seeing this tremendous decline. And so we have to have that context in mind when we're seeing this dramatic loss in the vote gathering power is part of that process, which was already in place, but the Takaichi phenomenon has really put paid to what might have been a reversal of that trend. So just to round things out, there's a continued relevance of religion in Japanese politics. There are nationalist objectives now within reach. These have been long cherished and cultivated and refined by ideologically motivated people who are very sophisticated, very passionate about what they believe the country should look like and how it should operate. These are very smart, actually very warm, compassionate people, I should also say. These are friends of mine. They operate in a world that contrasts with that of many others. There's a combination here, as always, what you might call the pragmatic and the transcendent. So we have this focus on, there are things that are already happening right now. Focus on increased defense spending. Used to be one of the things that Komeito would really hold the LDP back on. Now full steam ahead. Abandoning Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles. This is like to produce and maintain nuclear materials. Ordinarily, this was, and also to not allow, for example, US military vessels with nuclear weapons to dock in Japan. That might now be revised or abandoned. As Takaichi put it just a few days ago, she's determined to create an environment in which a national referendum on revising the Constitution can be held as soon as possible. And also, as you can see here from this photo, she's very determined to make a visit to the highly controversial Yasukuni Shrine while occupying the office of Prime Minister. Why is this important? Because Yasukuni Shrine is where Japan's war dead are enshrined. And so reliably, when any politician, but particularly prime minister, visits the shrine, it creates a firestorm within East Asia. Outrage expressed from China, Korea, other neighbors, and it creates all kinds of issues. I think we might see it happen given current conditions. And Takaichi, as you can see from this photo, has been a regular and dedicated attendee at Yasukuni for her entire career. This isn't, as I put it before, metaphorical or euphemistic. This is real. These are real beliefs. This is understood, and these, I think, we have to take it, if we understood in that terms, a lot of other stuff makes sense. And it also reinforces the idea that we can't really understand politics without taking what we call religion seriously. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Levy. Would you like to take the seat?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that was wonderful and very comprehensive and thoughtful presentation reflecting things that are very much going on the ground in Japan, and I learned a lot. I mean, maybe I can open up with one question. You know, I think in your presentation, you talked a little bit about Soka Gakkai's failure to mobilize voters in the short term.
Yeah.
That there basically wasn't a kind of enthusiasm given the rapid transition of Komeito from the LDP to the CDP side. But there was also kind of a long-term story that they're in secular decline. I guess, you know, to what extent was this election outcome, you know, a little bit of an exception? And, you know, if you give them enough time to get used to the new arrangements, would we expect that the opposition can do somewhat better?
Right.
Or, you know, is this pretty close to what we might expect moving forward? I guess that I'm curious.
This is really important. I'm glad you raised that, Philip. Thanks.
Yeah.
A lot of people forget that actually, so for decades, Komeito was in the opposition. And so what actually supporters of Komeito occupy a really distinctive political space in Japan. There are some of very few people to have spent a lot of time both in opposition and in government. That actually isn't the case mostly in Japan. So they have a depth of perspective that others lack. And so joining the government in 1999 came about ironically because of the Om Shinrikyo attacks, actually. In the aftermath of the Om Shinrikyo attacks, there were a series of laws put in place by the Japanese government. They were called the Om laws. They were all definitely used to go after Soka Gakkai and Komeito, and to target them. Because at that point, in a period of upheaval in the Japanese government, for the first time, you had Komeito politicians in government. And so, long story short, Komeito joins up with the LDP, and since then, but those initial years were tough. Mm-hmm. They actually did not get along well, and it took quite a long time for both Soka Gakkai and Komeito to convince local level Gakkai members to support the LDP, right? And so I think you're right. And this happened in the blink of an eye, and the members that I've been speaking with have told me as much. Like, this is what? And that they also weren't told, oh, by the way, you don't have a party anymore. They woke up to the news like everyone else did. They weren't like given special notice about it. And so that left some people cold, actually. Also, the death of Ikeda, again, I think is important here. In the absence of this sort of unequivocal authority on all matters, members are now feeling quite emboldened about expressing their opinions in ways that they, I think, would have held back on in the past. And so sometimes these things, for example, is a minority, but a significant minority of people who don't like the fact that, for example, this new party uses middle path because they think it's a misinterpretation of how Ikeda taught about the interpretation of Nichiren Buddhism. They said this is actually it's a crass appropriation, and instead we should abandon this. This is really a terrible, and there's all kinds of, I could get into them, but convoluted doctrinal arguments about this kind of thing. So basically it's really diffused things in ways that are new, but also just the fact that if you go to a Komeito rally, the average age is about 75. So, I mean,
writing's on the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we open it up to questions from the floor?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
I was wondering, like, so the difference between the view of technology in North America and Japan. Japan is more benevolent and spiritual and friendly. In America, it's like the 7 tech big businesses are. Sorry. So the difference between technology in North America and Japan, technology is friendly and spiritual in Japan, but in North America, it's like evil and there's nuclear weapons. Is there a Trump whisperer in Japan now that could help ease all this nuclear tension? And also, is there any are any of these big international money organizations affecting Japanese politics? Like the IMF or World Bank or?
Well, I'm going to raise that. Actually, I think you're right to a certain extent that there is a kind of a general sort of optimism about tech that I think most people, especially where I live now, know does not exist. We're busy trying to put data centers in everywhere. So for one figure comes to mind right away is the minority, so an opposition party leader named Anno, who leads this new kind of tech bro kind of party that's got quite a few votes in the PR lists actually this time, who in the recent days is saying things like, we don't have to worry about immigration. We just use AI instead. I'm like, have you used AI? So that kind of thing. So and also very importantly in this campaign, Takaichi very, very effectively used social media. This is a new thing for the LDP. They're very confused by computers mostly. But she really stole the thunder of what had in the election right before this been taken in a big way by an opposition party called Sanseto, a very nationalist, very right-wing party that very effectively used social media, especially YouTube, to run a very successful campaign. I think of it almost like an OnlyFans style model where you pay money and have your comment appear in the running commentary for these campaign speeches that are being given by the leader Kamiya. So by and large, Kamiya is also being accused of taking Russian money. So that's actually one of the big influences there. I do think perhaps it's already happening. There's a kind of a skepticism on the rise in Japan about tech actually, and about its prophetic promises. You want to go ahead? Oh, I just saw other hand. Yeah, I think I saw your hand next. Yeah.
South Korea.
Yeah.
It's the natural, if you want, the natural ally for a Japan that no longer is what it was a century ago. But you just mentioned this with the shrine and so on. There's this allergic reaction at the same time. Are they going to be? Is this new leader and this new wave going to actually just push them aside while the elephant China can just do what it wants? And
things are changing now. I don't know if you knew this, but Takaichi is a heavy metal drummer. And so is the current leader of South Korea. They're both really competent rock drummers. And a few weeks ago, they had a summit in Seoul where they played songs together. And honestly, that kind of thing goes a long way. We're seeing, that's pretty, I guess you could accuse that of being cosmetic, but it is indicative of a thawing in what had been a really bad relationship for a whole bunch of years right before this. And I think also just given what's the upheaval, the uncertainty about America coming, making good on its defense promises to its allies, the threats that China is now posing to Taiwan, and thereafter perhaps other places. So this is pushing them together now. And also what's interesting on the religion front is watching what's unfolding in Korea now with the Unification Church, basically modeled on what just happened in Japan. So the Korean government is about to legally dissolve the Unification Church, legally dissolve them in Korea, following a whole series of investigations and revelations about their political engagements. They've arrested the current leader. She was giving jewelry and handbags to the former first lady, all kinds of stuff happening that way. So I think that there's a resonance to be seen as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add, the Korea-Japan relationship, I think the current set of leaders that you have is the potentially most risky situation in terms of both countries' domestic politics, and things are still holding together. So that seems to be a positive sign. The initial rapprochement came under like a very easy set of leaders in some ways, so the Japan-China relationship is perhaps the more potentially challenging one at the moment. But I think, as Levi mentioned, if Takaichi does certain things like visit Yasukuni Shrine, I think that could complicate things drastically.
There's no way that we could possibly sell that domestically.
Yeah, so things could change very quickly depending on the kinds of decisions that are made.
I think it's.
Yeah, thank you. This is really fascinating. I was wondering about the transnational connection to the conservative coalition between religion politics in Japan.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, the conservative religious side in Korea has a long transnational tie with the conservative religious politics in the US.
Yeah.
Whether maybe not in only the contemporary era, but in Japan's even transition to modernity, the invention of state Shinto was a reaction to the conservative religious politics coalition from the European American side.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that, to what extent has that transnational in different ways figured into this?
You're hinting at a very complex picture. I'll put aside the historical aspects because it's a lot to say there. But more recently, major players in American conservative politics have reinforced existing ties that are significant. So Steve Bannon, for example, was brought in by Nippon Kaigi a few years ago, and famously, while he was in Japan, he referred to Abe Shinzo as the Trump before Trump, as being like successfully doing a lot of the things that Trump has ended up trying to do. And Charlie Kirk was in both Korea and Japan shortly before he was shot. So these are like, but my thought, spending time with, for example, Nippon Kaigi, is like, they don't really need these guys. They already have very strong ties in Washington without having these sort of like carpetbaggers do their job for them. They have a really long-standing sort of relationships. They're mostly confused by conservative Christianity, in terms of, as we all are, I think, but just in terms of like what it means, because I think largely because of the really small Christian presence in Japan. And so I've had these conversations, for example, with, like, for example, the Secretary General of Nippon Kaigi. He's asking me, like, sincerely, like, what's going on? Like, what's happening with these folks? And can you draw a comparison, for example, to what's happening in Japan? It's like one of these yes and no sort of situations, right? And so. So there are resonances, there's a natural allyship, but there's also very significant differences, especially when it comes to sort of like the public presence of enthusiasm driven by religion, because of the reasons I just talked about. That's just not going to fly in Japan the same way. Yeah. How about, I think back here, so yeah.
Thank you. This is a basic question, and maybe I missed something, but Takaichi has party support, it appears, in the lower house to make the constitutional changes. How is she hoping that the upper house will comply as well?
Thanks. Yeah, at present, she can't get the votes, right? But they require an election in the upper house. And I think the general hope or idea is that the momentum that's now underway and her political capital is such that it will drive a similar kind of overturning. So yeah, it's been a minority government for the past few years, led by the LDP. Pretty dismal, can I have to say that? Yeah, sort of leadership on the part of the last few prime ministers who took Abe's place. There's a real failure on the part to overcome crises, particularly the murder of Abe. I think Kishida, who was in power at that point, will be remembered as the prime minister who was in power when Abe was murdered, and it will be sort of tied to the Unification Church scandal, and thereafter to the slush fund scandal. So,
and ironically, because the prime ministers who were in power were not the ones implicated.
They were implicated, and they were also doves. Yeah. They were very much. I mean, and so if I talked to the folks that I've been spending time with, they hated these guys. and they thought of them not as not real LDP politicians. They just like they're so happy that Takaichi's in play. There's a level of jubilance. It's difficult to really give credit, like sort of to just, I don't know, characterize properly. I think it'll work. I don't, at present, what is it? You'll have to correct me, Philip. Is it 2 years from now that the upper house would have the election? So it's theoretically, it could go that long, but I think it will have to go that long because that's actually set by the Constitution. They can't have a snap election for the upper house. So and 2 years politically is an eternity. So who knows?
Michael, yeah.
First, a little comment. The question is, what creed, sets of beliefs undergird government management or government and the people? In the 50s in the United States, we all, in all the universities, as far as I know, across the United States, had to take a required course in American government. It's a full-term course. And it was really a way to inculcate into our young minds how sacred, how important, how significant, how meaningful the Constitution was. Now we're witnessing in Japan and the United States the polarizing of that. And so I'm trying to figure out in a comparative way, what about Japan in terms of basic beliefs? And I can't quite put my finger on how, I mean, I think that she's got, the Prime Minister has her eyes on certain things, and I think people who are fearful about constitutional amendments and so on are equally uneasy. But there's something deeper. I can't quite, in Japan, I can't quite figure out. And I guess it goes to the core of my question is that the domain of your talk has been political and politics and hesitate. I don't want to use the word shukyo anymore for fear that it has so many connotations. But no, we believe in religious belief. And I've been to Yasukuni 3 times and chit chat. There's a canopy there, and you can sit there and have coffee and tea.
Yeah.
And the gaijin sits down there, and immediately they're going to get attention. That happens all 3 times. And just chit chat. And one of the people would say, well, not everything that's here that you see is really what we believe in. We really like, and they tell me whatever it might be. So I'm trying to figure out what is at stake in the case of Japan when it comes to fundamental creeds, beliefs, hopes, aspirations especially given the fact that the Constitution is a foreign written document.
Exactly right. So you touched on a few battlegrounds here. So I would also parenthetically be really hesitant to say there's a unified American consensus at any point about
but there wasn't one.
Civil rights movement. No, but in Japan, it's like one of the battlegrounds has been history, and specifically textbooks at elementary, middle school, being in particular, because of this need to tell a story that is a lot of conservative people think has not been told properly. And it does touch, for example, upon the idea that the post-war constitution is imposed by the Allied powers and is an alien constitution that is at odds with what is characterized by conservative folks as a natural holism of the imperial family and the people of Japan in a sacred land. Yasukuni is a place where you see that that narrative take shape in a really proactive way, particularly at the museum on the shrine grounds, the Yushukan, which I encourage anyone to visit, actually, because it is just I think it's a very skillfully rendered museum. It's extremely impressive. And unlike a lot of museums in Japan, there's quite a lot of English. This is not always the case. Also Chinese and Korean significantly, to explain a historical revisionist narrative about the entirety of Japanese history, but very specifically the imperial era. So what happens in Nanjing, the rape of Nanjing, is largely marginalized, recharacterized. The start of the Pacific War is characterized in ways that I think would outrage many people. And so, that is where you see this push on the part of conservative people to sort of establish what I think you're talking about, which is like a unified, shared understanding, taken for granted understanding of the Japanese polity. And it will not happen easily, but it certainly seems to be in force now in ways that we haven't seen since I think end of century, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks for sharing. Do you think that the constitutional amendment will be a drastic or like a radical one? If not, what will be the restrictions? And especially, is it about the anti-war sentiment deep-rooted since the World War? Yeah.
This great, really important question. So it's important also to, there's something I glossed or didn't mention, is that the LDP is still in coalition. They joined forces with another party called Nippon Ishin no Kai, the Japan Restoration Party. And so prior to the election, they kind of needed those votes to get a majority in the Diet. They don't need them now, but nonetheless, there's an expression of we want to remain partners in coalition. And this is another party that's enthusiastic about revision, but they haven't shared exactly the same ideals for how things should be revised. This sort of, and I've actually been in the Diet in the last few years, been able to attend study sessions held within the Diet itself, actually, with elected officials and others on ideals for how the Constitution should be revised. Adding the clause to recognize the legality of the self-defense forces is absolutely there. But another really big one is an emergency powers motion. The idea that, and this is, I think, born a lot of the 3/11 experience, the March 11th, 2011 disasters. We need to have in place the capacity for the government to declare an emergency and make sort of quick and autocratic decisions about how to dispatch resources, and not just have a meeting in Tokyo every single time there's a huge disaster. And there's something to this. And so this is shared. What that will include and how expansive that disaster measures potential is, that remains highly contested. And so I think likely if there is some sort of attempt to get a referendum, a public referendum, it's going to have to be fairly modest in order to maximize the number of votes it gets from the public. But critics of this regard that as kind of like the beginning of a disastrous path, right? Of like from here we can see the rest of these aspirations come to be. And that's one reason why you've seen, for example, the Japanese Communist Party and others in opposition make preserving Article 9 their absolute, just central raison d'etre, which seems kind of quaint these days, actually. Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. For someone who doesn't know a lot about Japan, that was really thorough, and I'm feeling the tsunami effect of being overwhelmed by the various layers you gave. Well done, I say.
Thanks.
Some of this is being touched on by some of the questions here, even with the remarks that are on the screen right now. What is the purpose? I might think of Make America Great Again as a kind of an example. I can think circumstances inform choices. So I even think of maybe Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, in terms of, for some people, he's making big shifts in a very short time frame. And again, that's been the story, not just right now, but it seems in a few events in Japan, that there seems to be these crucible moments by which decisions and things are made. And some of it might be done for the practicality, the pragmatic. We got the Americans here, so Carney feels he has to do this. Maybe there might be climate change issues and a whole variety of things. What's the sacrifice? Here, the emphasis in earlier parts of the talk, the kind of a respect by some elements of imperialistic, which might conjure the same thing here. We're going to the Yasukuni Shrine. I might not be pronouncing all these words correctly. The Prime Minister having a long journey with this. You can think of the Civil War in the United States, a whole bunch of things. But then there's the Chinese, and depending how you perceive it, there's a sensibility of real threat. So therefore, do you adjust the Constitution for the self-defense, let's say? One could say that can be very practical. Have the times changed? We're no longer imperialistic, even though there's talks of it. How much of this is opportunistic, bringing in certain nationalistic, or depending how you want to define it, that there's really ideological formation? but using this to do something like, yeah, we need to defend against the Chinese. We need to be ready for a variety of things.
Yeah.
What do you think? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting on that mix, which is it does exist. I mean, these threats are real. I should also note actually that so I was in Japan until last week for a couple of months doing follow-up sort of interviews and ethnographic work. While I was there, Carney's speech has been taken up really seriously by academics, commentators on primetime news. His Davos speech is being analyzed by Japanese intellectuals and taken seriously as a kind of a potential template for another middle power, which is Japan does qualify as, in a way that I think is different, for example, like what Canada's position would be. The security threats are far more acute for Japan, because if you look at a map, it makes sense as what surrounds the country: Russia, China, North Korea, right? And these are real threats. And if America decides, which seems likely, to not follow through on its defense commitments, God knows what's going to happen, right? Then swimming with the other fishes of the world starts to look like a real possibility. But what will that mean? What will be required for that? That's when we get into these other practicalities, including constitutional revision, which, by the way, is embraced widely by all of Japan's allies, right? But then that also, I think what I would really resist is making a separation between that and these transcendent ideals. That we have to understand the motivation of folks like Takaichi's engagement with politics at all as being an ideological project, as being one in which you can realize this sort of this transcendent finality of Japan as a sacred land, and so there are, of course, practical aspects to that have to be undertaken, but ultimately it's about that kind of the sacrifices for that mission. And so I don't think we can separate those things. Yeah.
On that point, I was wondering, how do you tell if Takaichi is truly ideological versus she's being performative because she's a woman? That's one of the questions I had. The second question was, you mentioned that the vote gatherers for Soka Gakkai is mainly like homemakers. And we know that Takaichi is very popular among women.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you feel like she enjoys some immunity to it amongst people who have a general distaste for like corrupt LDP politicians.
Yeah, I think she does, remarkably, and it's obvious that she does. So, I mean, it's really striking, this election. So one of the reasons, like, the main reason why Komeito said, forget it, we can't work with you, is because she pointed, for example, this guy I just mentioned, Hagiuda, as acting secretary general for the LDP. And this guy, I mean, he's just like poster child for corruption. I mean, it's just like unbelievable. This one thing after another. First, it was the Unification Church engagement, and then the slush fund stuff. He's smack in the middle of it. And he's like, has this really, most influential role within the party, along with a whole bunch of others. But he gets reelected because of her power, basically, because of her appeal. There's no possible way he would have fared as well, at least. God knows. These are counterfactuals that are probably unwise to raise, but it's because of her appeal to women, and we saw this across the board. A lot of women being interviewed who's saying, like, yeah, I don't really like the LDP, but I love her. And so I was actually able also to attend the first rally that she had at the start of the campaign. So she launched her campaign in Akihabara, which is this techie town part of Tokyo. And why is it important? It's because that's where Abe Shinzo began all of his campaigns. And so it's very significant that she began in this, it's actually called sacred ground because of that connection. And there she is, massive security, by the way. It's really notable. I got wanded to get even like remotely close to hear her speak. Lots and lots of women in the audience. This was like a Tuesday at 10 a.m. And these are ordinarily, they're called gaito enzetsu, so they're sort of like outdoor speeches by politicians, super boring for the most part, really, really bland affairs, right? But there was an electricity there and a makeup of the crowd that was very atypical. Mostly it's retired folks, mostly it's people who are bored, passersby kind of dropping in to say, what's going on, you know? This was like electric. And very significantly also, I was told later that Nippon Kaigi had organized to show up. 200 or 300 members were there and they were waving the Japanese flag. Waving the flag in Japan is a very polarized thing to do. It's not a neutral symbol. It's associated with nationalism and generally with conservative politics. You know, it's not like waving, well, these days waving the Canadian flag has that effect, doesn't it? Never mind. Okay, yeah, so it's like that. So yeah, so that was that limit. So that has definitely been one of these sort of like moves that has shifted things. I would call it populism, okay? But we could talk about that. Yeah, please.
This is about something that was not covered in your presentation. So when we speak about elementary and middle school and high school children, they wear uniforms. So Japan is not exception. We have many countries, the children wear uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
So what uniform does to a person? I was someone who was going to school in uniform. So you put collective interest, your mentality is formed at the young age. So you put collective interest above your individual interest, because like in uniform, we are all the same. So basically, it is introduction of the children to a certain mode of thinking, and also it's also about collectivism.
Yeah.
Now it's much easier not to control people, but to make them as one nation, aimed on survival, if they wear uniforms. Now, when we go to university age, so this is age of high school.
If you could keep
It is age of hormonal rebellion. All these conservative views disappear. Now, what, not government, I mean, what is done against the media and
I need to ask you to ask the question.
So to bring back young generation to the conservative path. You know
that is what's happening. I don't think it has necessarily much to do with people wearing uniforms. I think it's largely a media-driven event, and it seems to be there's folks who are living on social media who are actually getting much more of that influence. And I was just, having, for example, taught at middle school in Japan to uniformed kids. They're plenty individual. It's a failed project if that was the intention. No, I do think that there is a sort of incipient sort of nationalistic past to that convention that is in place. What we're seeing, though, in terms of the trend of young people who are very enthusiastic about Takaichi, the LDP got a majority of the youth vote, as did the opposition party Sanseito to a certain extent. These are very right-wing, very nationalist parties. They've lost. The left has lost the youth completely. They are just living in the past, and it's really, really notable. I would be hesitant to say it's got to do so much with formal education. It's much more to do with new media, actually. Yeah.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you. Takaichi became the prime minister internally in October 2055, and then 4 months later, she got the supermajority. Yeah. So it was a very little time to perform.
Yeah.
So we have 2 years to have the upper house election.
Yeah.
What's going to be her challenges to win?
That's great. Yeah.
Is the economy is good now, Japan? No government can win inflation, cost of living. And the other one is the Emperor Hirohito declared he is not a living god after the defeat of the World War II.
Yeah.
So before the World War II, Emperor was actually regarded as a god, as a religion or not?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. Yes, and by the way, though Hirohito went on the radio to declare under the auspices of the occupation powers that he was not a living deity, that is not taken as truth by nationalist people in Japan, who regard him absolutely and non-metaphorically as a living kami, deity within the Shinto tradition, and it's absolutely the heir in an unbroken line to Amaterasu Omikami, as well as others as well. And so there's an effect that, and now one of the actually things we were likely to see, just to get to your first question, a whole bunch of measures that Takaichi is able to undertake, as you know, with this new mandate, that are likely also to pass the upper house. One of them might be to re-enfranchise the former royal families. So one of the efforts in the post-war was to basically disenfranchise what had been a much broader pool of an aristocracy. And they're still recognized as an aristocracy by, for example, members of Nippon Kaigi and other nationalist activists. And so that might become formalized. I think there's enough in place to actually make that, and enough anxiety about the future of the imperial line at present to want to sort of expand the pool, you know. But otherwise, some of the last points that I put here are likely to go forward. Sort of a general expansion of the defense posture. But the big issue is that what this will do is detract from the very big problem that Takaichi faces, is that her math isn't very good. And that what she has in place for the economy isn't going to work. Japan faces really severe inflation, really poor job prospects for young graduates. This is really Philip's territory, and I would leave it to him to follow up on this. But she's not, what she's proposing is not going to solve Japan's economic woes.
Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of, you know, electoral performance in the future, if you go back to the Abe government, you know, they had a strategy which was Abenomics, right? So they would do something that might seem unpopular, but they felt that if they went back to Abenomics and said, our job is to reform the economy and deliver jobs and prosperity, then they could continue to do well in elections. And I think that strategy was quite successful. And so I think the big question for Takaichi is whether she can come up with a similarly compelling economic message. I think currently it's quite weak. Yeah. And I agree that basically it amounts to sort of a deficit financing type of regime, which could actually backfire spectacularly if it causes a run on Japanese markets, for example. So I think, you know, we can't necessarily predict that she's going to continue to be as popular as she is today. There's some potential, and you know, she's on a better trajectory than most of her recent predecessors, but a lot could happen between now and the next election. We might have one. Yeah, Ben, why don't you go ahead? Last question.
Yeah, I was kind of struck by one notion. You mentioned kind of the large dominant narrative is that religion in Japanese politics is rather confined to the older demographics. You mentioned Kameto's rallies generally happen to be people 65, 75 plus. I was curious, with the sort of dominance of the LDP and within the younger demographics, does religion really play into that, or is it largely social media, jobs, other sort of more economic things, and religion might factor in sort of a cultural component, but not necessarily a dominant narrative? Or is there a youth faction that really cares about it at all?
No, it's a really important question. I'm glad you asked that. And it's a tough one. So this, what I'm trying to do, and I'm finishing a book on the intersection of religion and politics in Japan, is try to explode what we call religion actually. So in terms of conventionally named, like a Shinto group, Buddhist organization, those sorts of things. By no means, no. This is where you see the older folks really focus their energies, and the era of mass movements is definitely over. The era of collective kind of engagement in this community-oriented sort of shrine or temple-based activism is definitely not in place. But we have all kinds of concerns about the world other than the human. We have all kinds of non-metaphorical belief in powers that exist beyond the human realm that are active in, I would almost call it a client-based approach to spirituality, that's often called spirituality, to other things like that. Other ways of existing that an outside observer could, I guess, diagnose as religion, that is definitely underway among younger people. But those very same people would be very hostile to being identified as being religious for a lot of the reasons I was talking about. This is an endemic issue that for those of us nerds who study religion. So we need better language.
On that note, such an interesting presentation. Please join me in thank you very much.